Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to another one of our recorded lectures. In this case, we're going to be moving on to a new topic. We're going to be jumping ahead in time a little bit from what we talked about in the colonial period material and more into the mid-1700s, because even though things were happening in between those two time periods, we're really going to kind of center our efforts on some of the more essential parts of American history. And so, unfortunately, that means we have to skip over some decades every now and then. So the French and Indian War, in many ways, is really the foundation for some of the tensions that will erupt in the 1760s and 1770s that ultimately result in the American Revolution. It is a conflict essentially between Britain and its colonial possessions against the French. And so the name is a little bit misleading. It sounds as though it's the French against the Indians, and that's not the case. It is the British colonies and their Indian allies versus the French and their Indian allies, right? So there were Native American tribes that supported both sides of the equation. And so when we say the French and Indian War, this means the American colonists versus the French and their Native American supporters. And so it's a conflict that lasts, for the Americans at least, from 1754 to 1763. And so we'll go into a little bit of detail about America sort of prior to the war, and then what the war was, what it was all about and how it progressed, and then some of the consequences that it has for the colonies. So to give a little bit of background, America in the 18th century is changing fairly dramatically. It is still made up of those separate colonies that really function largely on their own, but it is becoming a little bit more, I guess you could say, modernized, in the sense that we see a growing population, partially because of immigration into the colonies. Certainly some colonies see this a little bit more than others. There is definitely a ramping up of the importation of slaves. This is certainly much more noticeable in the southern colonies and in the Chesapeake. But again, there is slavery throughout the colonies in the 18th century. So everywhere from New Hampshire all the way down to Georgia, every single colony allows slavery at the time. And there is improving life expectancy, right? Talked about at the end of the colonial material, changes in nutrition, changes in sort of life expectancies, changes in medical treatments. Those kinds of things are going to mean that more people are living longer. And in some cases, it also results in more children living out of childhood and into adulthood. So you have a population that is growing. Kind of going along with that then is an increase in the consumer culture, an increasingly diverse economy, especially in the northern colonies. And so there's a lot happening in the sort of early to mid 1700s. At the same time, there are a couple of really significant movements in terms of American intellectual history. And this is admittedly a fairly abstract kind of concept, but it is actually the area of history that I am trained in, is intellectual history. So it's the history of ideas and how ideas have impacted historical events, and vice versa, right? How historical events have impacted ideas, which sounds a little bit abstract and a little bit tough to pin down. But it is a really fascinating aspect of the study of history that sometimes might get overlooked, might get kind of pushed to the side as people look at military history or political history or that kind of thing. But in the early to mid 1700s, this is a period when we have two pretty significant movements taking place. One of them is known as the Great Awakening. This is the first Great Awakening. About 100 years later, there is another Great Awakening that creatively is known as the Second Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening is, in many ways, a response to the decline of Puritanism in America, right? Puritanism in New England is the outgrowth of the arrival of the Pilgrims. Talked about that a little bit in the last section. As Puritanism starts to decline, there is this push for a much more evangelical kind of religious faith. It is centered primarily in New England and in the middle colonies, but it certainly has its tentacles that stretch all throughout the colonial, the colonial America, all the way down into Georgia, the southern colonies, the Chesapeake colonies, and so on. There are a couple of primary figures in this. Jonathan Edwards is one, a man named George Whitefield is another one. We won't go into a lot of detail about the Great Awakening. Obviously, if you've got questions about it, I'm happy to answer them. It is a little bit difficult to kind of pin down in some respects because it requires a certain amount of depth of knowledge of religion in America at the time. And so, since we don't really have time to go into a lot of that in great detail, we won't cover it in this class to any great extent. Basically, one of the things that it contributes to the American experience, though, is an idea of American exceptionalism, right? The belief that America is in some way superior to other parts of the world, that it has a God-given mission to achieve greatness and bring that greatness to the rest of the world. And so the Great Awakening does certainly kind of contribute to those ideas in a general sense as well. Along with the Great Awakening, there is kind of a simultaneous movement that is centered more on science, more on experimentation, more on the application of reason to try to figure out the answers of the natural world, society, politics, those kinds of things. This is known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a primarily European movement, but it does have a fairly significant following in the American colonies, and fairly significant figures in America are sort of leading figures in that movement. People like Benjamin Franklin, people like Thomas Jefferson are either sort of actors in the Enlightenment, or at the very least, they are profoundly influenced by the Enlightenment. And this is sort of facilitated to some degree also by the growth of a print culture in the colonies. So books are still very expensive at the time, so people can't easily buy large libraries, but they can get newspapers, they can get broadsheets, they can get pamphlets, they can get smaller kinds of printed material that will allow them to access ideas. And literacy in the colonies is fairly substantial, right? There is a fairly widespread literacy in the American population. There is no significant public education system yet. So this is self-taught, or it is the result of what educational system there is. But it allows people to, as I said, kind of access ideas in a way that will certainly become relevant and important when we get to the American Revolution. The Enlightenment movement is really centered in Europe, but of the people who are most active or most recognized from the colonies, Ben Franklin is really right there at the top. And Franklin is basically an intellectual celebrity in Europe, even more so than he is in the American colonies, actually. And this is a result of a number of different things. For one thing, Franklin is prominent in a number of different scientific experiments of the time, especially experiments about electricity. And his scientific publications get him widespread recognition throughout Europe. He becomes sort of the belle of the ball in France and in England in particular. But he's also very active in political and social kinds of reform efforts. Franklin is a really, really fascinating guy. And if you get a chance, I would really recommend reading some of his writings and or reading a biography about Franklin, because he really is an impressive kind of a figure in a lot of ways. That doesn't mean to say that he was without fault, but certainly he's a really interesting figure to read more deeply into. But Franklin is really an international celebrity all the way through the 1740s, 50s, 60s, 70s. He is significant in the colonies as much because of his activism in social kinds of improvements. For instance, he organizes really the first lending library in American history. He organizes the first postal system, the first fire department, right? All of these kinds of things. He is not a political figure in the sense that he isn't the mayor of Philadelphia or anything like that. But he is a civic-minded person who sees a lot of opportunity for improvement in the world around him. And so he decides to pursue that. So we have a number of different people who are beginning to make a name for the colonies and sort of indicate to the rest of the world that the American colonies aren't strictly a frontier backwater where nothing of any significance ever happens. The colonies, though, in a lot of ways are still being seen as part of this mercantilist system, in the sense that the British and other European powers feel that North America is valuable primarily because of the natural resources that it has. Lumber, fur, crops, right? Those kinds of things. And there is a certain strategic value to the colonies. And so Britain and France are both extremely interested in establishing control over North America. Both of those European powers have a history of occupation of North America. Britain, obviously, along the eastern seaboard with the 13 colonies. France has Canada. And France and England have a long history of, at the very least, dislike, and at worst, outright war. And in the 1700s, there are a couple of instances where Britain and France engage in outright conflict. Primarily, those things are happening in Europe, though. By the 1740s and 1750s, France is beginning to flex its muscles in North America. They're beginning to either improve some of their fortifications or add fortifications around the edge of British possessions, especially around the Great Lakes, down the Ohio River Valley, and that kind of thing. They are also strengthening some of the treaties that they have with those local Native American tribes that live in those parts of North America. And taken all together, the colonists start to worry, and the British government starts to worry, that this is evidence of France trying to encircle the British colonies with the ultimate goal of sort of squeezing Britain off of the continent. Britain, though, has its hands full in Europe. They can't really do a whole lot at the moment to respond to these French actions in North America. And so they encouraged the colonies to sort of take on that responsibility. Now, the British colonies, especially colonies like Virginia, for instance, have very significant and in many ways kind of, as we would think of it today, almost ridiculous kinds of claims to North America beyond the Appalachian Mountains. What I mean by that is, so we've got these maps. This is a more modern version, but maps from the 1740s and 1750s oftentimes have these kind of amorphous boundaries that stretch just kind of out west, right? And so you can see that there with the boundaries of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Basically what this means is that Virginia, for instance, doesn't just claim the territory of what we would think of today as the state of Virginia. What it means is Virginia claims everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. So all of Ohio, all of the Great Lakes, from Michigan to Indiana to Illinois to Wisconsin, all the way out to the Mississippi River, at the very least, the Mississippi River, Virginia is claiming all of that for itself. And so as France begins to build some of these fortifications around what's today Pittsburgh, what's today Detroit, these, as far as the Virginians are concerned, are in some ways infringing on their claims of territory. And so the British government, since they're not able to get directly involved with resisting these French actions in North America, the British government says, hey, Virginia, are you going to sit back and let France do this on your land? No, you're going to have to get off your butt and you're going to have to go out there and you're going to have to drive the French away. And so they try to do that, but it doesn't really work out all that well. And so that's going to be the subject of our next section when we get into the actual French and Indian War itself. And then the consequences, some of the early consequences of the French and Indian War. And that will lead us then into the next topic, which is going to be how do the colonies go from being very proud, very enthusiastic members of the British Empire to suddenly, relatively speaking, suddenly becoming antagonistic and bitter and ultimately rebellious against that very same empire, because that's a really incredible transition that only takes about 10, just a little over 10 years in many ways, even less in some cases. So that is our stopping point for now. I hope everybody is doing well. Make sure that if you've got questions over any of the stuff from the recordings and or any of the full PowerPoints on Blackboard, bring those questions to me and I will happily help out with those. So we will come back then in our next section and get a little bit deeper into the actual French and Indian War.